It's my privilege to welcome you to Plenary 3, exploring the relationship between basic science and the public. I'm Sam Dyson with the Science and Society Funder Collaborative, with whom I've been a Civic Science Fellow, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. You will be able to see in the chat in a moment a link to open Civic Science Fellows positions. The focus of the session is on equitable public engagement, specifically in basic science, by which we mean curiosity-driven research that may have few or no obvious societal applications. We begin with prepared remarks from Shobita Parthasarathy, situating this conversation in an equity framework. Shobita and I will then have a short conversation following her remarks to reflect on how those remarks relate to basic science in particular. Then we'll invite feedback on Shobita's remarks from our panelists, Marta Entradas, Leslie Krohn, Susan Renoe, and please see the speaker bios below. We'll close with a Q&A. And like the entire conference, the session is a springboard to further exploration with deeper dive sessions happening later today and an equity-specific plenary tomorrow. Because these 50 minutes will go quickly, we really want you to be able to engage throughout. So we want you to think about the chat as a space to share insights and relevant resources. The chat is what you see by default on the right. Think of the Q&A as the space for capturing our collective inquiry. You can click the Q&A button in the upper right-hand corner of your event platform. Because we won't have time to answer all of your questions, we at least want these questions to be visible there in the Q&A and recorded along with this session. So with no further ado, Shobita.
Everyone, and thank you very much for having me speak to you today. My job is to talk to you a little bit about to inspire you, to excite you, to challenge you perhaps a little bit, to give you some questions to think about as you're considering how you want to engage in science communication work. And in particular, I want to do that around issues of equity and how we can think about equity in the context of science communication. And equity, of course, is something that we've been thinking about a lot recently, certainly in recent weeks and months, and perhaps even over the last few years. And I don't know that we talk so much about questions of equity when it comes to science communication. And so I want to tee that up, and hopefully we can have an interesting conversation about it as well. To the extent that we think about equity in science communication, we tend to focus on science communication as a mechanism to encourage participation among marginalized communities. But I want to suggest in my remarks today that if we really want to take equity seriously when it comes to science communication, that we need to be thinking about it in a much more mutually engaged way. Because whether we're talking about one-way communication or we're talking about two-way dialogue, scientists are still the ones setting the agenda. They're shaping the conversation, right? Whether it's, and I include myself in that, right? If I'm speaking to community members at a science cafe at a pub, for example, right? It's my research, it's my framing of my research that shapes the conversation. And I think that it's really important for scientists, in order to engage equitably in communication, to think about this process as an opportunity for scientists to learn and understand from the communities that they seek to engage in. And that is particularly important at this very moment, because we are seeing publics in a much more complicated way, and much more, the publics are engaging, of course, with science and technology in all sorts of ways. And this is something that we as scientists, as people who are interested in engaging with publics, that we need to think about and we need to take seriously, right? Science is really part of everyday practices for publics. I mean, if we just think about the last year, for example, science is really central to our lives, but it's been central for a few decades now. And as a result, publics really see the complexities of science, the limitations and uncertainties, and sometimes the ways in which they may or may not be actually represented. And that's really key, right? We've seen it certainly in the case of, for example, the Flint water crisis, where industrial pollution has had a real impact on communities. And the Flint water crisis is also another kind of really important example that I'm going to talk about in much more detail today. And that is a place where publics had knowledge that scientific communities didn't necessarily accept, certainly at the beginning. And it also demonstrates that often scientific knowledge is shaped by the communities where it's being produced. And as a result, because scientific knowledge is often produced by communities that tend to be slightly more privileged, often scientific knowledge doesn't necessarily represent the needs of the most marginalized communities. And we've seen that in the context of the women's movement, and specifically the women's health movement, how scientific knowledge actually was damaging in some ways to women's health. We see that in the early AIDS movement, where again, scientific knowledge kind of ignored the needs and concerns of people who were starting to suffer from HIV. We've seen it among African Americans, and where particularly potentially problematic environmental degradation was happening. And yet we still have this perception that publics know less than scientists, and even that can lead to real complications for publics, which then ultimately hurts public trust, as do these other cases that I'm talking about. And that is part of a key message that I want to impart to all of you today. And I want to complicate this notion. There's the experts, and then there's the lay people or the publics, a general perception of public ignorance. But I want to make a few points before I get into how we can manage this. The first is that scientists are publics too, right? We tend to talk about scientists and publics, but of course we're all publics. We're recipients of knowledge in all sorts of areas. We're members of the community, and I think that's really important to remember. Second, there isn't just one public. So you'll hear throughout the presentation that I talk about publics, because that just acknowledging both the fact that scientists are publics and the fact that there isn't just one public should complicate our efforts at thinking about engagement, because we have to think about, the particular, the context, the audiences. And then finally, as I've already suggested, that publics often have crucial knowledge and expertise that is important when we think about these discussions of science communication. And I include this little editorial cartoon here in part because this is how we tend to think about publics, right? That they're ignorant, that they adhere to beliefs, political beliefs, values that are counterproductive. But in fact, I'm not necessarily, this is funny, but part of what I'm interested in is what it is that we as experts, as scientists, gain when we perceive of publics in that way, and what do we lose by perceiving publics in that way. And so today, for the remainder of my presentation, I want to provide you with 6 tips for engaging publics in a more equitable way. First, I'm going to talk about how scientists need to reflect on where we're coming from, right? This is before we even engage anyone. That is, we need to reflect on ourselves. Why is it that we want to engage communities? Do we want to get something out of it? What is it exactly that we want to get out of it? Who are we? how does our background, our educational background, our identity, our privileges, our personal stories, our passions, how does that shape our scientific work and interests and our perceptions of the public? Are we already engaged with non-scientific communities? And might these be places where we might be more comfortable? And what might we need to do if we are engaged in these communities? If we want to move outside of those communities, what do we need to know before we do that? And perhaps most importantly, am I open to learning from communities just as I am imparting knowledge from my work and expertise? The second thing that I want to emphasize is that we need to prepare to learn about the communities that we want to engage in. We want to learn about the community's history and context, specifically vis-a-vis science. As I mentioned before, there are so many communities that have fraught relationships with science, and those tend to be marginalized communities, and those tend to be the communities that are increasingly the focus of science communication engagement efforts. And so you see here an image, sort of pretty iconic image about a well-known scientific study, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where Black men were observed in the community, and in order to understand how syphilis moved in the community, what the experiences of men who had syphilis were, both in terms of risk, but also in terms of health impacts. And when the most controversial thing about it is that once a treatment became available, it was not offered to these men. And so it seemed as this major breach in scientific research ethics. And of course it is that, and it has had a long-lasting impact on trust in the African-American community of science, but it's not the only moment. There is a long, long legacy of distrust in the African-American community, and frankly, mistreatment by the scientific and medical communities of the Black community that we need to know about if we want to participate in science communication with these communities. There's long histories, for example, of scientists believing that people of color had thicker skin and therefore were, sort of more hardy in some ways in managing certain diseases. At the same time, there have been assumptions, for example, that Black people of color, but specifically Black people, have inferior lung capacity. And that scientific assumption was built into a technology, the spirometer, that has become very important because it measures lung capacity in the COVID-19 pandemic. And even today, we still use that technology that is based on faulty science. And there are many other examples of this. And so it's really endemic, and it's partially due to the fact that our scientific communities are not particularly diverse, and there are certain perceptions and certain biases within our scientific community. And we need to be honest about that legacy, that history, that context, and our own position within that if we want to engage in honest engagement with these communities. And similarly, there's also a very long history for sterilization in a number of these marginalized communities, not only among the disabled, but also people of color. And that was an example of certainly public policy that was deeply problematic, but public policy that was certainly informed and carried out by both scientific and medical communities, not just in the US, but across Latin America as part of a colonial project. The third tip is to be humble, especially when it comes to the limitations and uncertainties of science. So one of the wonderful and amazing and incredibly powerful things about scientific knowledge is that it's generalizable, right? It's scalable. Often it depends on averages. But the problem, especially when we're talking about marginalized communities, is that this often leaves out people who are at the extremes, who are at the margins. And so then that calls into question when and how publics benefit from scientific knowledge if they're really based on aggregates. And here you can think about the example of fence line communities. These are communities who often live close to environmental pollutants, chemical plants, for example, and they are often most at risk from the pollutants that those factories emit. And those factories often have periods when they're producing a lot of pollution and other periods when they're not. The problem is that our scientific knowledge and the policies on which that scientific knowledge is produced often focuses on average pollution. And so it doesn't get at the flares. And so fence line communities themselves developed air bucket monitoring mechanisms to basically capture air at the time of the biggest plume of pollution, and then ask regulators to test those things. But at the beginning and for many years afterwards, it was incredibly difficult to convince scientists to take this knowledge seriously because it didn't fit within the usual conventions of generalizable, scalable knowledge. And related to this point, we want to make sure that we listen and respect other forms of knowledge. And here I'm not just talking about, the limitations of science, sort of the flip side, right? So there's the limitations and uncertainties of scientific knowledge, but then there are other forms of knowledge that might be better at capturing, especially the concerns and the priorities of publics, and in particular, I'm talking here about marginalized communities. And here we can think about the example of the Flint water crisis that happened just in my backyard and is still a source of real trauma for people in Flint. And here we see an example of individuals who knew there was a problem for months, right? They talked about the color of the water that you can see here. They talked about how they were losing their hair, how their children were breaking out into rashes, that the water had a funny smell. But the scientific community and the science policy community in Michigan and at the EPA, the regional EPA, kept dismissing this knowledge. And they kept saying, well, you have to flush the water for 30 seconds before you use it. That's to get the best sample. That's how they would sample it in order to do their scientific studies. But of course, who on a daily basis flushes your water for 30 seconds, especially when you're talking about a costly utility that people had to pay for in a lower income area? Nobody was going around flushing the water. So that's the problem with the science and the need to be humble about the limitations of science. But it also shows that we as scientists, as experts, need to think about and take seriously other forms of knowledge. And this became a real issue in the Flint water crisis because, in the beginning, you had publics bringing in their knowledge and their concerns. You had scientists finally engage on this issue, but then those scientists ended up shaping the conversation to focus on lead and not on a problem that became equally problematic that again, members of the public noticed, which was that the contaminated water was linked to Legionnaire's disease that was killing a number of people in the community. And again, that became a source of real controversy between the scientific community and publics. Next, it's not just a matter of listening and taking public knowledge seriously. To take that public knowledge seriously, you've got to make it count. But in particular, what I want to emphasize is that you need to respect the time of publics. If you want publics to engage, then you have to make it worthwhile for them. And you can do that by respecting their time so that their engagement actually influences you in some way, or that they're particularly getting something out of it. And here I'll return to the case of Flint, where now they've created a program called the Flint Community Water Lab, where they're engaging young people in participating in science. And so that young people are actually learning about how to analyze water and analyze the health and contaminants in water. And this serves multiple functions, right? On the one hand, it engages students, young people from marginalized communities in science and gets them excited about it. And at the same time, it allows them to participate in something that's of serious concern in their community, but also to help to repair trust between scientists and publics in the Flint community. Another example is among Native Americans and DNA research. So there's been a lot of interest among scientists in particular in Native American DNA. And there was a controversial case, for example, at Arizona State University, where Native Americans provided their DNA to scientists for one purpose, and the scientists realized that purpose, it sort of became a dead end, so they shifted priorities, and this seemed like completely obvious to them, but the Native Americans were deeply distressed. They sued on this basis. They said, we didn't consent to this use of our data, but this has now been transformed into national efforts to engage Native American communities in DNA research, again, having them participate in the scientific work, getting them excited about the potential for scientific work, but also participate in how this work gets done. But then the flip side of that is to integrate community knowledge into scientific work. And this is also key. You can't have one without the other, because it then is an incomplete sort of attempt to really ensure trust. And I think at the end of the day, this is about maintaining trust between scientific communities and publics. And here, I think excellent examples come again from Native American communities, that we have tended to want to kind of dismiss Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous histories, and really just suffocate those communities, and certainly dismiss it when it comes to anything related to science. But Australians recognized a few years ago that, in fact, Indigenous communities had real crucial, relevant knowledge when it came to wildfire management. And more recently now in the US and on the West Coast, our wildfire managers are starting to take that Aboriginal information seriously as they plot wildfire management strategies. Similarly, you have, again, scientists interested in ecosystem biology and, as related to that, sustainability, taking Native American knowledge about ecosystems seriously, especially about the historical legacies of ecosystems. And really, to understand how ecosystems came to be, you have to have a sense of the historical context, and Native American communities can provide that information, but also provide crucial data about how to engage in perhaps fishing, but also in scientific observation in a sustainable way. And so I've given you a few tips. I hope I have challenged you to think about the relationship between scientists and publics in a more equitable way. And I think at the end of the day, the key here is really to respect publics. And if we start by respecting publics, then I think that we can make real strides towards ensuring that our science communication is equitable.
Shobita, thank you so much for those remarks. And there's lively conversation happening in the chat and with questions in the Q&A. So I wanted to just ask you a few follow-up questions, given that your comments really are ones that every form of science should attend to. And given the focus on basic science, you advised a two-way or mutual approach to learning with communities. What kind of two-way learning enriches basic science research, that basic science that tends to be, in many cases, have least obvious connections or relevance to those communities?
Thank you very much, Sam, and I'm excited to be here. And thanks for that question. So I think the first thing to remember, and this is why, of course, when I started, I talked about publics plural, and I talked about how scientists are publics too. I think the first point is to remember that even though basic scientists are engaged in research that seems really far removed from social implications, Scientists are part of society, right? And we're part of institutions. We're shaped by what funding we receive or don't receive, the priorities of our institutions, and our own worlds and lives. And that has enormous impact. It has enormous impact on the kinds of research questions that we ask, the ways that we think are the best ways of answering those questions, the kinds of categories we come up with, and even the kinds of answers that we come up with to our questions. That can be hard, I think, sometimes to wrap our heads around, but you know, I gave a few of those kinds of examples, right? We tend to assume, for example, that we've tended historically to assume that indigenous knowledge doesn't have anything to contribute, but it turns out that, for example, fundamental ways of thinking about ecosystems we learn about from indigenous peoples of all kinds. Some of our worst histories of racism aren't separate from science. They're in fact part of our scientific legacies, right? Our histories of phrenology, our histories of eugenics, that's basic science too, right? And that's about desires to categorize, desires among scientists to understand and sort of find explanations for why white people were superior, essentially, to people of color. And finally, I'll give an example that seems like it's incredibly basic, and yet it is on the basis of these kinds of social dimensions inside science that upon which more applied, more technologies rest. And that's an example that anthropologist Emily Martin talks about related to reproductive biology, which is that there's a really long history in reproductive biology, and some of you may know this, of thinking about sperm as being extremely vigorous, right? They move quickly, and eggs somehow magically, right? Until relatively recently seen as big and lazy. They don't move very quickly. You know, to put it bluntly, right? Our assumptions about about gametes were shaped by our assumptions about men and women. And obviously I suggested that was also true when it comes to race, right? Those are extreme examples from our 2021 sensibilities. They seem obvious, but I think the point is that that's always there in little bits, right? And so that's why I started and ended with this idea that we need to reflect on where we are in our positions and the ways in which our work is shaped by our social context. Because those are also opportunities, I think, to connect with communities. Because again, we tend to think about science as being on a pedestal and not in any way engaged with society, and then publics as being, you know, only society and not really containing any knowledge. And if we kind of complicate all of those categories a little bit, then we might be able to complicate scientific categories in ways that are more reflective of our societies.
Thank you so much. And I will turn now to our panelists and just invite their reflections on the things that you have shared, just as they have already been reflecting on them in the chat. And so I'll first turn to Marta and ask, Marta, Shobita notes that scientists set the engagement agenda. In your research, how do you see scientists and institutions setting agendas for public engagement? What patterns do you see that we should be aware of?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Sam, for this question, which I will address, bring from research, which, while not new, might be helpful to a little bit engage in basic research and how to better engage scientists and institutions in it. The first thing I would like to say is that there is, we've been observing a significant increase of scientists and research universities and institutes, and we know large body that has emerged over the last years mainly with a focus on scientists, a little bit less institutions of communication, but this is also emerging. And I would like to refer to an international work that looked at the institutional environment for communication across. What we found is that there is increasing efforts and resources that go into public communication. There is also increase in the professionalization of science communication. This is both at the individual and institutional level. For example, communicators within institutions. There is also a very important aspect concerning policies and for engagement that are in place at institutions, and also we friends countries and world regions with different traditions of public engagement and also very seems to be good news. But the research also shows that still early stages, there's still a lot of work to do, at least the way we think about public engagement. And so that scientists still do not engage with publics. And we seem to rely on a few more actually about the research with the public, and even less that go and engage with communities. One way seems to be still the preferred way to communicate with publics, and this is evident both with scientists as well, and dialogical and participative approaches that seem to be a little bit on the side. So there's actually a good what to do in engaging and making scientists and institutions more aware of the need of these engagement. As Shobita has mentioned in her talk, one important thing that I would like to talk about is science see the public. And we know from research on science communication that many times we see what they as imaginary public, something that really don't exist. And we saw a lot of examples that Shobita in our talk. So what I would like to see about us to think about is actually the idea that they are part of the conversation. They should be giving an opportunity to do so, and we publics part of the scientific process and consider their motivations and excitement for participation. I think I'll leave it here.
Thank you, Marta, for those comments, and apologies to those who are having a little trouble hearing the audio. We will, do our best to address that. So apologies for that, but thank you for your comments so much, Marta. Leslie, as someone who helps to guide public outreach communications for a scientific institution at Argonne National Labs, what opportunities and challenges do you see for more mutual two-way engagement? Challenges and opportunities. Are there exemplars or barriers you'd like to bring to the conversation?
Well, thanks, Sam. And I'm just going to hope that you can hear me a little better. I heard Marta perfectly well, so I'm really confident the recording her remarks, but hopefully you can hear me. If not, I'll try and keep it brief to ease the pain. I think I really had to reflect on some of what Shobita said in terms of publics and understanding who they are. You can never invest too much time in understanding your audience, and a lot of times we gloss over it. We say, oh, it's the general public, or oh, it's science interested. Actually really understanding them is a great investment of time, and figuring out what makes things relevant to that audience is really, really important, because you're never going to engage if the audience doesn't think the topic is relevant, and that can be a challenge. I think a lot of times one of the barriers is that the people who are talking, whether that's an institution or an individual, have something in their mind that they want to say, right? I have this and I need to tell people. And I usually coach folks to turn that question around, right? Meet your audience where they are, right? Understand your audience and say, what do they need to hear to advance their thinking and to advance their knowledge and to move them along? And keep in mind, you're playing a long game, especially in basic science communications, right? So don't try and do everything in one, 15-minute presentation or talk, right? So understanding the audience, making sure you're relevant, meeting them where they are, understanding what they need to hear, right, that ties into their motivations, I think is really critical. The one thing that I would add on when you talk about equity in science communications has to do with the people who are doing the speaking, right? On an institutional level, that's something I have to pay a lot of attention to. And, the institution has X number, finite number of employees and scientists, and they break down into several categories, some who are super eager to participate in the activity, some who are willing, and some who want to avoid, right? And so as we kind of think about our representatives, we're trying to filter, equity, diversity into that. And that's a bigger organizational issue. We've got to get the right people into the organization to have a diverse group of people to call on. And that's, I think that's an issue that's beyond the communications of the science, but really about how you build that team to do it. And beyond that, I think there is a lot of, from an organizational perspective, there's an opportunity to train people both on the messaging and the delivery, and to prep folks for the activity and not just assume they're going to be good at it, right? So that's an opportunity, for organizations to take advantage of. I'll leave it at that. You were on mute there, Sam.
Thanks so much. Yep, the double mute click. Yeah, thank you, Leslie, for that. Susan, when helping researchers broaden their the social or societal impacts and benefits of their work, how do we support scientists' interests, recognizing that they need to start from a place of their own interest while also supporting the kind of mutual agenda setting that Shobita recommends?
Thank you, Sam. Good afternoon, everyone. First off, I would just say meet them where they are. I know several speakers have talked about the fact that scientists have constraints, funding, tenure and promotion, family life, all those things. And at ARIS, we encourage researchers to find their broader impacts, or what we might call their public engagement identity. What we want with that is that it blends what they're passionate about in their research, what they're passionate about in their life. We also support them in learning about ways of engaging the public that honor and respect stakeholders, as Shobita.
It's important that many scientists are great at engaging the public and try to do the work
from the right perspective. Sometimes I think it feels like we generalize that all scientists don't do a good enough job or subscribe to the deficit model, and not all do. But it is important that we help them find ways to engage. Otherwise, they might get a little bit discouraged. And I think that that's part of it here. At the University of Missouri, one of the things we try to do is not only train them and encourage them, but also help them find ways to engage the public. I saw in the chat that there were some questions about how do we make this happen? And I think one of the questions is, what's the infrastructure that we need to build so that we can have these great interactions that are mutually beneficial? The other thing that I remind researchers when I talk to them is that their science is really important. I'm never telling them that their science isn't important and that the public engagement is the only part, but we want those two things to work together. So I would say that the key thing is to help scientists to align their interests with the interests of the people that they're working with. Remember, again, we keep talking about it in the chat and talking about it here. Shobita mentioned that there are many publics and that science can do and help them is to create systems that value engagement, whether it's promotion and tenure or goes for
them in their field.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And by the way, Marta is still here with us. She is just on video mute, saving bandwidth. So please know that she is still here and active in the conversation. And we're also eager, as I mentioned at the top, to make sure that we have captured the questions that you have. There's active engagement in the chat, but the Q&A is also active as well. And we won't be able to answer all of those questions, but please do continue to enter the questions there, because then they will be recorded along with the recording of this session. So one question there that I'd like to just pose to you all. When we hear people talk about citizen science and mutual engagement, it's often how the citizen impacted research. Where have we, any of you, witnessed discussions or research on how these engagements deeply affect the scientific or research habits, the thinking, or the thinking of the citizens as well? Like, where do you really see this two-way learning and change in thinking and change in habit occurring? Shobita, do you mind?
Sure, that's such a great question. And I think that there are lots of little cases that I know about. I think it would be nice if we could find a corpus, or maybe even develop a corpus, so that people, I've often thought that I need more of a resource. I'll just give you a couple of examples. So one is not quite what we tend to think of as citizen science, but it is about citizen engagement, and that's about the inclusion of patient advocates on peer review panels. So in the 1990s, breast cancer activists, some of you may know, were able to get a sizable increase in government research funding for the disease. And one of those things that also happened at that time was that they also said, you know, we have an understanding, we have to speak about expertise, like we have an expertise in breast cancer that you as molecular biologists, as geneticists, don't have, and we want to be at the table. And so they, you know, there's something called Project LEAD that breast cancer advocates created to sort of train up scientists in some of the technical language. And scientists themselves have reported that this provides them with a different understanding of who's at stake, what's at stake, what are the kinds of costs and benefits we need to be thinking about when we think about what looks like it might be an important discovery versus not, right? I mean, you actually have to think about what are the priorities of someone who's suffered from or known someone who's suffered from breast cancer. And in addition, I know that in California, for example, these perspectives have actually shaped scientific research, specifically around environmental causation for breast cancer, change the kinds of questions that scientists are asking, you know, in terms of, for example, you know, looking at questions around environmental causation by neighborhood tract as opposed to by zip code or county. And then I'll just also briefly say that, again, to go back to the Flint example, because of course it looms very large in all sorts of ways for me, is something that was created in the wake of that called the Healthy Flint Research Coordinating Center, which I think is another really interesting example of mutual research. And in that case, right, as you can imagine, in the wake of the Flint water crisis, researchers from all over the world flooded into Flint. All of a sudden, this city that had been forgotten became an object for science, which I think is something that we as scientists need to be careful about. And the citizens of Flint said, no, wait a second. If you want us to participate, it has to go through a citizens committee. We need to make sure that this is something that's actually going to benefit us. And in return, we will help you get funding, right? We will support this work. We'll help you get access to the right resources and the right, you know, sort of research subjects, et cetera, but we have to make sure that this is mutually beneficial. So those are both interesting examples, I think, because they are exactly mutually beneficial, and they're building up the relationship as well as, I think, both public knowledge and scientific knowledge.
Thank you. Leslie, a couple questions seem to reflect the general sentiment. This sounds great. How do I do it? How do I learn how to understand audience and give me some, resources? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So, first, as a communicator, remember, coming at this from an organizational communications perspective, when you're doing science communications, build in measurement mechanisms so that you know who came to the prior ones. So one of the first things to do would be to say, take a look at who came the last time. So we do a series of public lectures, and we have a roster of the 200 or the 400 or the 900 people who came. Scan those, see what their job titles are, so see what organizations they come from, see what their email addresses look like, right? What can you learn from data? And so to the communicators out there, build in measurement mechanisms, because you can mine that data to help understand the audiences. The second thing that comes to mind is start the presentations or the engagements with questions. How many, in an in-person world, which we are all, thirsty for, but we don't have yet, right? By show of hands, how many of you are familiar with XYZ topic? Or how many of you have had an experience, with whatever the subject matter is? But you can start in an engaging way, as opposed to here's what I'm going to tell you, right? So there's ways in the moment, I think, virtually and in person, to do that kind of things. If you are able to leverage technology, asking questions or polling features, those are other ways for you to understand your audience in the moment. Because if you ask a question like, how many of you are familiar with the South Pole telescope, and everybody says I'm familiar, you can just move through that part of your presentation quickly. Whereas if you get feedback that says I'm not familiar with it, you spend more time there. So those are just a couple of ideas, I think, to get people started on how to better understand audience.
And it's likely going to be our last question, given our time. But Susan and Marta, I would love your thoughts. What if you are a theoretical physicist? Something I aspire to be when I grow up one day. On my way back to grad school in physics, in fact. What does this mean for you? Or if you, study taxonomy, as was mentioned in the opening talk, how do you begin to think about your work in a different way if it is the kind of work that you might think is quite far from the communities that you might want to engage?
From my perspective, it's building the infrastructure to make that possible. I mean, I work at a Research One institution, and we still have graduate students who have to hide from their advisors that they are trying to do public engagement. We have to build infrastructure that makes it easy for them to engage. We have to build infrastructure that values public engagement. I put in the chat something about moving from activity to impact. Getting systems of assessment and evaluations that we know that we're having impact in the work that we're doing. I think it has to be that. I think there's not one thing that fixes the problem. I think that there has to be infrastructure and systems that influence that. Someone also mentioned about funders. I know that from our perspective, the broader impacts criterion has been great for public engagement, at least on the NSF side. People have to do it. They can't get away from doing it. So I feel like pressure from funders to do this work, valuing it on campuses for this work, all of it works together to build infrastructure that makes people want to do this work and see it as valuable.
And Marta, in the style of a good BBC interview, you've got about 1 minute remaining for a final thought.
I hope you can hear me now. I mean, there's really a bad connection
great.
going on here. So the point, the motivations of scientists, and this is based on a lot of research that the most important is basic scientists as well, is their intrinsic motivation. Just a message, I think, trying to get scientists to understand what is satisfying for them. And I think this also brings implications for institutions that to implement more strategic approaches to scientists' public engagement with the building of reward we kind of they will engage more in public engagement. The show for those who already engage. And so what I would leave this conference with the for the reward structures could crowd the scientists already existing and this could have more cost than benefit.
Thank you so much, Marta, Leslie, Shobita, Susan. This has been a terrific conversation, and thank you to all of you who have attended it and contributed to it in the chat, in the Q&A. This has been a really rich conversation, wouldn't have been without all of you. We want to remind you that this is a springboard to further conversation and exploration, deeper dives happening later today, as well as an equity-specific plenary talk tomorrow, and lots of other sessions in between and besides. So thank you for being here with us, and have a great rest of the conference.